Contrary note, declare that carried. Thank you. Takes us to local board input. As I mentioned, Troy Churton, representing Ōrākei Local Board, to discuss private helicopter and helicopter applications in rural residential areas.
Thanks.
Troy,
thanks,
your hand.
Chair, Chris and co-governors. The memo is just making its way around. Hopefully there's enough copies, but I'll just keep it to bullet points. End of July last year, this committee received a memo from Phil Reid, Auckland-wide Planning Manager, regarding the management of helicopter flights and helicopter landing areas under the Unitary Plan. I've only got a few copies of that memo should anybody need it. There were three options in that memo. The third of the three options talked about plan changes, but at no time was there a reference to the use of prohibited status as an option, which would probably be a form of plan change anyway. The memo also made it very clear there are two types of assessment, two types of activity really. There's the activity of a private residential application to build a helipad, and then there's the flight-related activity related to that built resource. The Ōrākei Local Board position, and remembering this is about residential helicopter activity, folks. It's got nothing to do with other types of non-residential helicopter activity. The Ōrākei Local Board position is that private residential helipad activity is not normal residential activity, and there shouldn't be any reference to it ever becoming so in Unitary Plan. Private helicopter travel, perhaps achievable for less than 1% of the population, doesn't have a strategic transport policy outcome. The widespread community feedback we hear, not just from our constituents, but for my sins, from constituents all around the city, some of which I've shared with Councillor Chris, to show that once you get a bit of profile for fake news related to a topic, you attract all sorts of people who think you're the messiah when it comes to helicopter control. Not true. But from all around the city, I get the similar sorts of complaint from all types of people. Probably the most notable was a Samoan priest, head of a Samoan church in South Auckland. What can we do? What I'm saying is that the negative effects on communities from the applicants of very few is grossly disproportionate and therefore justifies prohibited status for all residential helipad and flight activity in residentially zoned land in the urban isthmus. Addressing it as a non-complying activity is not adequate enough. The memo says it is for residential activity. Our board position, and it is a board position, is that is not appropriate. In the memo also it was noticed by us that Phil Reid said that one of the reasons for not supporting prohibited status or not supporting plan changes is because there's only been a few applications and it wouldn't justify the resource. Absolute poppycock. If you go about determining what's good planning based on that sort of rationale, you'll never get good planning because it only takes one or two applicants for very, very far-reaching effects to make some significant impacts on the community. And avoiding a plan change just because there may only be a couple of applications with major effects is not a good reason to not recommend prohibited status. So I'm sorry about the double negatives in that, but I believe the advice that was given for not pursuing option 3, or at least a prohibited status through a plan change, was poorly represented to you. So over the page, just very quickly, currently you've got non-complying activity status attached to these sorts of things. You've got to look at helipad development in conjunction with the activity that's generated off a helipad, i.e. flying, noise, etc. There's some recommended wording that you can make sure it does exist in the plan, if it doesn't already, to show that residential helicopter pad and flying activity is not anticipated and will always be considered exceptional. And the need to do that, if it doesn't exist, is even more important now that we've had the Rod Duke saga. And the last thing we want are planners for wealthy applicants looking at helipads, leveraging off the Rod Duke case, and before you know it, you've got a permitted baseline of private residential helipad activity creeping into the isthmus. The time to act is now. The time to make helicopter pad and helicopter flight activity in residential zones a prohibited status is now. Not in 2 years' time, not as part of a suite of other reviews, now. So that's the key thrust of it. Two little sidebars. Council could and should, in our view, also be lobbying broader to increase the height, minimum height for flying of these sorts of devices. Currently, I think it's 1,000 feet or 1,000 metres for private craft, 500 for emergency. One way to mitigate effects is to increase that by a further 500. It's a possibility. Emergency craft always have the discretion to fly lower for relevant purposes. So they've got that discretion. Do they really need to be monitoring us at 500 metres though? I doubt it. Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. I think you've outlined it well in the memo as well, in your submission, your written submission there. Members, the advice note was distributed to all those members that were part of the council last year, early last year. I think it was about June, but it's also on Nexus. That advice note came about after I was concerned and made inquiry. And I can also say that Mr. Phil Reid is also following up with the Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation Authority. I think it might be the former rather than the latter, keeping in mind that the America's Cup 36 coming our way is likely to see a big spike in helicopter traffic. So just a request from Ministry of Transport, CAA, to be talking to our council staff about how is that being looked at, how is that likely to be managed. That's in addition to the points that Troy has raised today. Some good points. Let's take some questions.
Maybe none.
Councillor Casey first, and then Councillor Newman, and then
Hi
Councillor
Troy,
Watson.
two questions. One, I wasn't quite clear about your comment during your presentation about fake news. Were you referring to your personal complaints about the emergency and police helicopters?
Well, that's
And the
why it's
second
fake
question?
news, Kathy, because actually most of that activity had nothing to do with complaints at all. So I don't want to, it's not really relevant to this.
No, I still
Yeah.
didn't understand your comment.
Yeah, that's what it was in reference to, a lot of media attention regarding a previous matter which has no bearing to residential activity.
And so my second question relates to that. While you say this was not about emergency helicopters, there is in fact a position stated that you gave verbally and in your memo that says that council could and should require emergency helicopter flights to be raised by a further 500 metres.
Yes.
Is that
as
a
a
stated position of the Ōrākei local board?
As a supplementary thing, it's not relevant to the residential unitary plan related thing, which is the main thrust of our
So that was,
submission.
but you've brought that in writing and verbally to
Yeah.
the council today.
That's
So
right.
that is
As
stated
a means
position
of,
the board.
of mitigating noise, one option could be, that's for exploration, to see if the heights for flying could be increased. We don't know. We're not the topic
That's
experts
not
on
about
noise measurement.
residential helicopter use.
Well, can I just come in here? Can we just listen to each other? Can we just respect the question?
Yeah.
And then we'll have the response. Can I have the question from Councillor Casey?
The question was that I didn't understand why this statement about council should and could and should require emergency helicopter flights to be raised by a further 500 metres, how that relates to what Troy's come in to ask us today, which is about residential helicopter use.
Okay, so an answer might be, if you're looking at ways to deal with the effects of residential helicopters, and one of those ways could be to see if the minimum height in which they're permitted to fly could be increased, then at the same time it might be effective and efficient to consider all range of helicopters, private, business, emergency, whatever, and whether their height restrictions are adequate as well.
So that's the bit I didn't get, really. That's a different issue from the one that he came to ask us about.
Councillor Newman.
Good morning, Troy, and Happy New Year to you.
Same to you, Daniel.
Can I just ask, private helicopter travel, it's a bit beyond my pay grade, so just a question with respect to height limit. Is there an issue with, if we've got private helicopter travel, they're flying at a higher elevation, is there a risk in terms of a congested flight path across suburban Auckland with commercial flights coming into land, having helicopters operating at a higher level? Is there some risk there? Could you explain that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's exactly the sort of exploration that we're suggesting could be looked at as a sidebar. It's not the main thrust, but above 500 metres, minimum flights we understand are allowed to come down to 1,000 or feet. I think I can always get it confused. And whether that would impact on other types of flight zone, I don't know. It's just for an explorative type of.
I'd be interested in understanding more about that. The police tell me that it's difficult for them sometimes to operate the helicopter in certain parts of Manukau, given the flight path. The second thing, I guess, is in terms of the prioritisation of the workload. I have a concern about the unitary plan too. My concern is about cumulative effects of stormwater. I think there are issues with respect to zoning in flood zones and zoning in areas subject to inundation. So in terms of prioritisation, your view is that this has to sit alongside or ahead of those other issues, or can I take it from you that you're happy for me to address your issues, but I need to address my ones first? I mean, where do you sit in the pecking order?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say as a value judgment that this is before those very valuable issues, but I would say that this is an example of a land use that affects broad and lots of communities and lots of people. And so it's no less significant to be included in what other unitary plan reviews are going on.
Do you have any, last question through you, Chair, do you have any empirical information of the noise effects of a helicopter operating, say, 700 or 800 metres above us?
Right on me, no. Through my, I sit with the ACNN committee, the airport noise control. I mean, it would be easy to get, I'm sure, but I can't offer it to you now.
What's the timing for you being able to provide that?
With support from people who've got the source, anything's possible in a couple of weeks, I'd say, Daniel. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Councillor Watson and Councillor Cooper, please.
Just very quickly, Troy, and just in terms of those effects and what the rules are as it stands, there's no requirement at the moment to have any kind of buffer zone in these, buffer area in urban zones. So just a single lot section is sufficient for you to get access.
Well, the only examples that I've had, we've seen in Ōrākei recently, was an application for such a development in Paratai Drive, right, which I think has got a mixture of mixed housing and single in that area, but I didn't see any buffer-related activity.
And similarly, with the number of flights that are permissible, is there any controls put on that, on the actual number of times flights can be made?
Yeah, so the current approach is case by case with looking at policies and imposing conditions on the grant of consent, and I think there was a suggestion that there would be a maximum number of inward and outward flights for the Duke case, for example. So you can impose conditions to allegedly dictate the use. Yeah, but we're trying to say, well, there are some uses of land which, quite frankly, are always or should always be prohibited. I mean, gunpowder manufacturing in your backyard and that sort of thing, whatever it might be.
Councillor Cooper.
I just wanted to ask Mr. Churton if he knows that calling staff advice poppycock is a breach of the code of conduct. It's actually, I mean, I know he's passionate, but Phil is a very, yeah.
That's my job. I should have picked that up. But look, I just cannot recall that particular part now. But look, you're highlighting it. Can we, let's just focus on trying to achieve the right outcome here, and it's very early in the year, and we'll continue to be respectful. So, are there any other questions here? Troy, is the thrust of this concern about noise, or is it more than noise? Is it about loss of public amenity? Is it wider environmental effects beyond noise?
It's wider than noise.
Yep.
It really comes down to the value judgment that underpins a lot of land classification as to whether the activity of helicopter development and flights in residential areas is one that should be enabled in any way or should be prohibited. Now, there are lots and lots of land uses that we've never associated as being appropriate for residential areas, you know, and this is just another example. Like I said somewhat churlishly before, if somebody wanted to develop their own shooting range, for example, if they were lucky enough to have a 2,000 square metre section, then whether it's in Manurewa or Paratai Drive, and they were a passionate gun person, the chances are that having your own private shooting range might be considered an inappropriate thing for a residential built-up area. That's all we're saying.
Okay, so members, you've seen the advice note from last year. In some ways, that advice note was an interim solution, you could say. It was identified that we may not have been assessing helicopter landing pads, or particularly the landing and takeoff as well as we expected, and that has been closed up. And I'll ask the Director of Strategy to address that. There's a couple of other items here which are really lobbying and advocacy to the Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation Authority, and that's the height of helicopter traffic across the city. I think currently, generally, it's 1,000 feet over land, it is feet, we're talking nautical, and it's 500 over water. But of course, even parts of around the Waitemata Harbour, 500 feet over water, and you're in close proximity to a lot of residential. That would be for the Tāmaki and many other areas of Auckland. So we'll address that, and we are following up with, again, Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation on what we can expect for the America's Cup 36 coming very, very soon. Looking at flight corridors rather than just fly anywhere, because there is significant intrusion. As we witnessed on Anniversary Day, actually, there was a lot of helicopter traffic on Anniversary Day just gone. So I'll hand to the Director and to give us some guidance on how we could address this going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, yes, just following Mr. Chewton's previous discussion with us, we have worked with our regulatory counterparts, and we're working together to better process and understand the effects of these activities should they come our way. And as we said, that this was kind of it was an initial thing, and we would like to monitor and just to see if that's making a difference, and if there are, what the kind of effects are coming. So we're still really, I believe, in that monitoring phase, and we're happy to bring that back to you as part of a bigger package around the broad unitary plan monitoring, and we can specifically address that for you at that time, unless there's anything more you need us to do.
Okay, any responses to that advice from our senior staff? Councillor Casey?
Just have to reiterate my concern about including emergency helicopter use in this debate and in any re-look at regulations. I don't think it belongs there at all.
Okay, I think you make a good point. So I think the emergency helicopters, they have a special place. They need to respond. I'm not aware of police or emergency Westpac flying indiscriminately. I'm open to seeing the evidence, but I think we need to be focusing on the residential use, and I think that is the thrust of the submission, so if we can strip it down to that. So the intention was for staff to be monitoring this. They are. That was conveyed earlier or last year. We'll continue to do that. We've taken the submission. To do a standalone plan change for this, we need to think about that against all the other planning work we need to undertake. And we will be undertaking, members, over the next year and 18 months, some significant plan changes in response to climate change. I would suggest, I think I don't need to say anything further, but that is our big focus. So we will look at this into the year, but there's probably no good argument to have a standalone plan change, Troy. Okay, so we'll pick it up. Councillor Watson. Happy to move. Do I have a second, please? Councillor Walker. Moved and seconded.
Thanks for accommodating time, Chris.
Thank you, Troy. And thanks to Aoraki Local Board, please. Thank you. Seconded. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, if we could